Let's get started. Last week, we did a live stream on my favorite product launch of Paradigm, DinoAI v2.0, and we discussed what is really the cursor for data, and we gave an overview of how it works. So, what makes DinoAI v2.0 my favorite launch is that it's not just a code agent that provides analytics engineers generic DBT code. It understands the structure and content of your data warehouse and your repository. And when you ask it questions, it's scanning your data warehouse, it's looking at your DBT project, and it's providing you very tailored, specific, useful code. It can save you probably, Kalstoff would argue 99% of the boring analytics engineering work. I'm going to go with 80%, but you're pretty set on 99%.
I am pretty set on that 99%.
All right. This just in, I changed my mind. It's 99%. Kalstoff, take it away.
Cool. Thanks again, Parker. It's great to be here talking about the second edition, second version, new generation of DinoAI today. So last week, we did the launch of the initial DinoAI agent geared towards bringing the cursor for data experience to analytics engineers. And what we've seen so far from the initial feedback we've gotten, people feel empowered. People feel independent. And I think that's one of the biggest objectives that we wanted to see from end users, where they don't feel daunted by having to learn a new framework or a tool. They feel empowered and independent to work on their own. Now, this week, we are expanding on that DinoAI v2 performance and that context. So I'm going to go through a quick refresher what we released last week. So last week, we showed the world DinoAI v2 cursor for data, and what's it built for is it built for analytics engineering. And it has the complete warehouse context with sensible guardrails and a power to bring your own context. And today we are going to be double clicking down on that, your power to bring your own context into the picture. Now, compared to tools that are out there, I think what we are seeing is that when you're using software engineering code editor like Windsurf or Cursor, you tend to run the risk of generating code for, you might be using Snowflake, the code you're generating is for BigQuery. You run the risk of actually not having the full context available to your code ID, to your IDE. As a result, you might not be able to generate code or output as desired or as expected. So you tend to end up with a lot more mistakes and hallucinations, which are the problems that we are solving with the Paradigm Code ID. Now, one of the things that we've seen and that we wanted to also bring, and going to be the focus of our conversation today, is how can we give the agent a lot more targeted context. So think about it this way, that you have a DBT repository with hundreds of models, but they are in different folders, they are different files, etc. And you want the agent to only work on a few things. You don't want it to look at the entire repository. So how can you actually tailor that agent experience to your own needs? And that's what we are going to be showcasing today. We are focusing on that context usage part. How do we actually expand that context usage? How do we bring more enrichment around that context usage? And over to you, Fabio, to rock and roll.
Awesome. Thanks, Gustav. Great. I can see my editor is really live. Perfect. The scenario I want to walk you through today, what we saw last time was me super excited about Formula One starting the season, building a bunch of model. It's a scenario that I think happens pretty regularly within our spaces working with data, which is our source data keeps changing. So we have a new table getting added and potentially new sources being added. And that's usually a problem because we need to go and update these sources to the YAML. So what I'm going to do today for the very first thing is, how can we be using DinoAI to pass explicit context? I know that my data engineer has loaded a bunch of new tables in my Formula One schema. So I want to go now and just open DinoAI. I can see I'm in code mode. Just going to paste my prompt, say, hey, I've added a bunch of new sources in here. Can you update my file? Now, what I'm able to do with the new release that we're launching, I'm able to pass explicit context within my DinoAI chat. So I have a few options here. We'll talk a couple of them during the call. But the first thing, I want to add a file. So here I can go and just search for my F1 sources. I'll press enter. And effectively what I'm doing now is I'm explicitly telling our DinoAI agent to update this specific file for me. And DinoAI is able now to go to the warehouse, look for the schema in the database for my Formula One data in here. And on the back of that, it's going to go and find what are the tables that are new, which are not available in my DBT project. Right away, come up, then I have lap times, pit stop, qualifying, and sprint results. Those are new table, which were not available to me before now to do my data modeling. And with the additional context I provided and the capability that we have with the DinoAI agent, now what we're doing is we are calling your Snowflake database, or my Snowflake database in this case. I'm getting the agent to query information schema and metadata about my tables so that it can effectively update my source YAML. So this is something that happens so regularly in any type of workflow. We are constantly keeping updating those sources.yaml. Extremely powerful to save us time in not having to second guess what's new and make sure that we have a very seamless experience when we have to work with data. So in a few seconds more, it's going to go ahead and just update our file for us. So again, I can click on accept. And as you can see, I have still my existing sources that was there before. So this is very powerful because probably in our sources, we're going to maybe be adding tests, adding descriptions. We don't want to regenerate the old file. We don't want to lose that information. And if we can scroll down, we can see that a bunch of new tables have been added to my sources based on what was new into my database. So that's feature one. How can we use the new adding context feature in Paradime to update, for example, our sources.yaml?
Just a quick question. If you were to have to do this by hand, how much time would this have taken you? Because here it took less than maybe 10 seconds.
Totally. I think this will be at least a half an hour job to go and find what are the columns, what are the tables that I have new, find the diff, make sure that I'm not creating a new sources.yaml or a duplicated entry, then the DBT will complain, which means then I have to test a bunch of things as well. So a massive increase in speed of development for those really not fun tasks, and I think no analytics engineer should be spending time on. What we want to get to is how can we build business logic, how we can solve real problems.
Cool. 10 minutes, half an hour versus 10 seconds. So Parker, that's where my 99% rote work removal comes from.
Totally. Awesome. So let's go to the second use case now, which is I have some new tables. I have some new and updated sources of YAML. So what I want to do is I want to be able to understand or create an analysis or anyway a marks table, which analyze pit stop strategies for teams, right? So I know that I've updated these sources of YAML, so I need to create a bunch of stage files on the back of it. Now, we already have a bunch of files in our repository under staging, and I want to now pass context to DinoAI to say, hey, go and create a new file for me for the pit stop table and make sure that you use exactly the same format and exactly the same construct that were previously there in my project. In this case, you can imagine what we want is standardization. We want to make sure that when we work with our SQL and our DBT models and our files, we keep a certain degree of a standard within the work we do. So I have another prompt here. It is, okay, now can you create on the back of the sources I've just created a staging file for the pit stop table? And again, what I can do here, I can add as a context, okay, another stage files I have, let's say the stage F1 drivers, to make sure that the same structure is applied and we are renaming the column in a similar fashion. So I'm going to go ahead and press enter again. And what we'll see now is passing the context, the agent is able to read which files I'm explicitly telling the agent to use as a baseline. And now it's going to create for us the new staging file, which uses exactly the same format. I can go ahead and click on accept now. And what we're seeing is that it separated the multiple word in column names into 2 or 3 more spaced words using underscore as an example. So renaming a bunch of things. Again, I didn't have to repeat myself explaining what is the standard I want to be applied to my project. But by simply give it an example and say, hey, this is how I do my work. This is how my other project is set up. Can you go ahead and do this for me right away? This is extremely powerful because normally we'll go through these loops more and more time where we're adding new tables, we are doing a new set of data models, and really we don't want to think twice or 3 times like, how do I structure my model? How do I structure my naming convention? How do I do this? But actually providing the context to the agent is able to clearly identify what is the standards I'm using in other files. In this case, 1, it could be more, and make sure they apply the same rule. And you can see here, it came back with a nice explanation of all the rules that were applied just by reading that file. The next thing up I want to call now is All this so far is just one file. We're just telling the agent to say, read this file and generate something out for me. Where things becomes extremely powerful now is we want to create an actual marks model. So we want to actually build some business logic here. So I know based on the data that I'm aware of is that to calculate my analysis, I have two models. I have to pass as context, pit stops and races, because that's what I'm trying to do. So what I can do now, again, by being able to pass context to our DinoAI agent, I can go ahead and use another prompt here. And here in the context, I can go ahead and open file, and I'll say I want F1, I want pit stops. So this is context number one, where my raw data comes from. And now I want also, and I go to files and races, and I go here. So now I'm basically being a lot more explicit on, I know where is my data. I don't want my agent to second guess. I actually know exactly what I want, and I want you to start building this logic for me. So I can choose which files I want to pass as context, press enter with my prompt. And now what the agent is expected to do, it will go ahead and read those two files for me, understand what is in there, understand what kind of business logic can be built on the back of that, so that ultimately I can get to my analysis. Okay. So again, it's understanding where I want my file to go based on the prompt, and where is the context, or where is the existing SQL file or transformation that is available to me. Again, particularly in the world of AI, context is key. LLMs are super powerful, but we need to make sure that we provide the right guardrail to do the right thing for us, but also have a much more human interaction where we're able to tell exactly the context and what we're here for, what we're expecting them to do. So it's super simple, create a nice file for us with a bunch of calculations in here, and also some nice space delimiter of the columns that it's using. I can again go ahead and click on the accept button. And in a matter of few minutes, we actually went all the way through from adding sources to then create this sort of like base model for us, make sure that they follow a certain standard, then we provide, and then ultimately go ahead building this data model that we wanted to use for understanding more about pit stops and races metrics and so on. This is one of the flow that we see around using DinoAI, which is really doing this process of development, right? And building new models, updating models. Of course, we want to make sure that every time we make changes, we are also updating our documentation, something that is often left behind, right? So how many times I'm the first one probably then say, hey, I'm going to go and create a bunch of models. I'll go back to the documentation. I'll do it later. What happened is that ultimately we come back with 3, 4, 5 files into a Mars folder. None is documented. None of them have tests in place. Now, I think the era of opening one file at a time and clicking on generate DBT docs for it, I think that's past. I think we live in a different place now where things are a lot more autonomous. We're able to instruct a lot more what AI and what the agent should be doing for us. So you might have noticed before that when I clicked on the add button, I have actually a few more options here. I don't have only add file, but in Paradime, we provide you add active files, which will effectively open more of the files than I have open here, or open context based on the file I have selected in my ID. What we also added now is the ability to add files of multiple steps within the directories that I have. So let's go and look at this for a second. I can go here and look at some of the folders I have in place. So I have a couple of models. I'm actually going to ask to really nicely remove this one here, there. And I have a folder basically with 3 models, right? None of them have documentation. Now, I don't want to really go here and say, hey, model number 1, generate documentation. Model number 2, generate documentation. Model number 3. I want to have one single prompt, one single command that goes and say, hey, I have a bunch of files in my Mars folder. Can you document this for me? And this is what we are able to do with the additional context that we have provided through agent. So I can just pass this, add here, click on directories, and now look for my Mars folder here. And I can now press the send message button. What we're able to do now is to basically instruct the agent to go and say, hey, please check for me which files are here first. And it's going to come back with, okay, I can see that there are a bunch of files. Let me go and read what these files are. Okay. And on the back of this, it's going to read first file, the second file, the third file, and really start thinking not only about generating documentation as a point in time thing that we do, but actually work alongside us in a real world scenario where actually I'm going to have more files. I'm going to have more files in one folder. I don't want to go and do them one by one. So on the back of this now, went through, read all the files, read all the context that I provided, and read through the information that was required, so that the agent now is actually parsing those files, getting all the column details that we need, so that we can structure the schema.yaml with description that we want in there. Again, extremely powerful, because really this is what we'll find ourselves to do multiple times. We're never going to go and create one model. We often going to be creating various different set of models, traversing our folder structure multiple times. And here we go now. We have a nicely structured YAML files with all the columns defined, with all the descriptions that we want here, and all the information we want in one single shot. So really not having any more to think about spending time on generating files individually or generating documentation individually for our models, but rather complete our work at the end of our pipeline. Say, I have now 4 new models. Let's go and just document all of them in one single shot. Make that documentation available for the end user as well. I have one last thing that I'm also very excited about is all the example we've seen here is about DBT creating YAML files for the schema, testing the previous session, creating documentation, updating sources. But DBT is actually a lot more than that. So we have configuration file, we have the DBT project.yaml, we have potentially macros, we have a lot more things that we have to deal with in our day-to-day, which again, I don't think they're fun things. I haven't heard anyone that say that it was fun to update DBT project.yaml configuration. It's just we have to do it. It's part of what we need to make sure that we get the best out of DBT as a framework. But fundamentally, that's really not what we want to spend your time on. Some people are aware that we can use the DBT project.yaml as a main configuration file where we can structure in which schema we want to write our table, what kind of tag should be grouped on. It's a simple thing to do to keep our DBT project consistent and in line, but it's also something that it doesn't come natural, really, particularly for users that are kind of like starting working with DBT. Now, what we can do with context is, let's suppose that, and I'm just going to open the folder here for a sec. Here, now I have, and I can probably get rid of this one. So I have a bunch of folders and subfolders in there. And I want to make sure that based on my model or folder structure, I want to make sure that we update our dbt project.yaml with relevant information around which tag we should implement for each of those folders and in which schema we want our table to be created or views to be created. Given this, I have one simple instruction that I can give the agent to, which is, can you update my dbt project.yaml to map all my models to my folder structure so that each SQL file in the respective folder will write to the respective schema and also make sure that you add tags. The only thing I'm going to do now is to just add the dbt project.yaml. And let's see what the agent will come up with. So I'm asking the agent actually to give me an opinion about, hey, I know what I want, but I ask the DinoAI agent to come up with his own recommendation, right? So went and was able to read through the DBT project.yaml file. And at the same time, we are now also scanning the project repository to get an understanding of how the folders are structured and what we have in there. And what we'll see now is in my new dbt project.yaml, we were able to set a generic configuration that if no schema is provided or materialization is provided, make sure that everything is materialized as a view. But then it nicely starts setting these things for me, which is, okay, the source tables or everything which sits in the source folder for me should have this tag or combination of tags and might be materialized as views. For everything which is in the staging folder should go into a schema called staging. And also we're going to have more based on the name of the tables or models we have there, it's going to go and add additional tags. Similar thing for intermediate. Then it's cleverly enough that marts is what we expect to be materialized as stable in most cases, because it's what get presented to the end user. So we want them as fast as possible to be able to get data out. So we also went around creating for the marts folder, the materialization of stable for us with some additional tags related to the model specifically that were in that folder. Again, it's as simple of clicking accept to see all these updates coming through. And again, using AI, I don't even have to worry about writing a commit message, but actually we can use the write commit using AI feature of Paradime to provide a commit message that makes sense to any reviewer there. So I'll wrap it over here. I think we have a minute to answer any question we might have, but super excited to go through this workflow. And if you notice, I haven't wrote not even one character in any of the files I've opened. It was truly through the panel and the agent and prompting. I have not even touched any of the files that were there.
I have one question, Fabio. If you think about it, having these smaller contexts Does it mean that if I'm an end user, I'm using my context properly? Means I'm actually generating much better code that are more likely to hallucinate way less, and it's controlled because you're always working with a smaller surface area.
Oh, totally, 100%. I'll give an example, right? If I had 10 different sources.yaml, which is very likely, right? Without providing that additional context to say, I want this YAML to be updated, any LLM or any AI application will not know which is the source data I'm talking about. So they will have to go scan through all the files, second guess which databases and which schema are mapping to which. And there are two issues there, definitely. One is a potential hallucination because fundamentally the agent doesn't know really which part should look like. But also it's time, like there's a time involved of going back and forth databases and cross-reference, and the LM is taking the right actions. Quality of the output, it's increasing massively, and then just speed because we can direct the agent to do the right thing in the right place.
Yeah, because when the context was not available, when I was playing around with this, I would find that it would generate a lot of schema YAML files. There would be like a duplicate of one model in one schema YAML, and then there would be a duplicate of that in another schema YAML and things like that. But when you narrow the focus, you basically increase the quality of output. That's what I'm getting here.
Correct. And it's also, I think, a much more natural way to interact with the agent, because if I had to tell one of our engineers to update a given set of our internal pipeline, I probably wouldn't tell them, hey, go and find out which one is the set of sources that maybe has the new table and maybe has not. It's just not the way how we work. And I think when we think about prompting and working with agent, we should treat them as our colleagues, right? So we want to make sure that we instruct them with the right level of context information.
Yeah, because the chances that you are working with a completely blank slate, empty project is way less compared to, okay, you've connected a repo that is already there and it already has, let's say, 600, 800, 4,000, 5,000 files, 5,000 models in there. You do not want to scan through the entire directory. It just wouldn't be useful. But whereas what you do is go to a particular folder that is already there and you want to improve, let's say, the code quality within that folder, or you want to have more documentation or add a new model within a particular context. That's more like day-to-day analytics engineering work.
In our lifetime, we probably see maybe 2 or 3 repositories which are empty. Most likely, you're going to set up a repository once, and then it's just going to be incrementally add more models in there. Or it's never the case that you're going to keep creating this blank repository. So in most cases, you're always going to work with something which is existent, and we need to make sure that we have the right tools and functionality to point the agent to the right thing in the right place.
Gotcha.
And a lot of analytics engineers are familiar with add context through Cursor. Is there a difference between how our add context functionality works versus a Cursor?
I can take that for sure. The short answer is yes. And the reason is because aside from the context and the user is interacting with through the interface, we build our own set of toolings that works behind the scene to make sure that the right context is routed from the right set of the repository. We spend time in Paradime developing functionalities that work alongside user action all the time. Context for the file structure, file repo is one. Something we build as well, which is extremely relevant in this case and super powerful for user, is context around their data warehouse. So metadata about tables and models and where the sources live and what kind of metadata we have available, data types and so on, which is massively important because that's what ultimately SQL files in the DBT world, they're mapped to a table in our warehouse, and we need to make sure that context is available all the time.
Perfect. And another question I have is, if I have a big existing DBT project, I had this project before Paradigm, I'm bringing it into Paradigm. In what scenarios would I not want to use add context if I'm trying to expand my project and bring in new source tables, for example?
Bringing new source table, you won't need to use the context as we're seeing right now if you're creating a new source. So and by source, I mean we're actually adding a net new source all the way from the ground up. So we're not updating a file, but we basically say, hey, I want the DinoAI agent to go to the warehouse and get the information I want for this particular set of schemas. In that case, My suggestion is, because you already have sources, it's always good to provide some context, as I've done in one of the use cases earlier, because we are prompting then the agent to make sure that it's using an existing structure of how we define sources, which is also very important. So it won't be required. The agent will say, hey, can you go and generate a new sources.yaml for me for this new schema that I've just ingested in my Snowflake or BigQuery database. But providing more context, it will mean that it will follow an existing structure that is already part of our DBT project.
Okay, thank you. And last question I have, does add context read into files that aren't currently published into your main branch of your repository? So can you add context to drafted SQL files?
Oh, totally. Yeah. The files doesn't have to be committed, doesn't have to be in a branch. As you can see, I've actually added context during the call to non-committed file. So I've created my stage file based on what I've added in the sources.yaml, and then I've created the final marks file based on what I created just now in the stages file. Everything that exists in your repository as of now within the Paradime IDE is available to as context. As a matter of fact, you can also use as context files which normally are not Git tracked, like dbt packages, and what we have, the Paradigm Scratch files, which contains like example queries that you might be working on. So anything which exists as a file inside your Paradigm interface is available to you.
So could you use, for example, I have a Scratch file with a bunch of working SQL that I have tried, tested, everything done. Now, could you use that Scratch file as context and give also the context of a directory and say, hey, this is the Scratch file, this is the directory. Can you now build a DBT model that adds the right references for this code and convert it into a DBT model?
Yes. So there will be various different ways of how we can tackle that, which is super exciting. Got that here, which is our workflow normally always starts in exploring data, right? We never go and write DBT models right away. So I could definitely work with Paradime and create a simple or like a rather just standard SQL query, and then take that file that contains that SQL query and say, can you translate now into a DBT model? We'll have a lot of flexibility on how we want to do that. We can let the agent try and figure out what are the refs existing in my project, what are the sources, or even better, we actually go and point the DinoAI agent and say, translate this SQL file into a DBT model. This is where the sources related to this will work. And as you mentioned as well, also you can inform the agent where you want your file to be created. So if you have a complex DBT tree structure for your DBT project, say, hey, I want this mars.finance to go in there and not into another file.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's like properly dope, because then it just totally fits into your existing workflow. I've done the query, I run the SQL, I know what the data looks like, and now I want to productionize it. Path to production from exploratory work is super easy.
Totally, 100%.
Which is the perfect segue into what we're starting to build out with DinoAI is. So what you've seen in this session, and if you watch the previous session, we're talking about the DinoAI agent in the context of DBT development. And what we're cooking up now is how to use DinoAI in running it in production. So we will discuss that a bit in the future. And just a sneak peek for next week, we're doing a similar live stream like this. Fabio, do you have a Dino rules file in your project right now?
Not right now. I've removed it specifically for this session.
Perfect.
But,
Smart. So what we'll go over next week is how to use Dino rules. So in a nutshell, it's a file where you can give any instructions to the Dino AI agent, and every prompt you write, it will reference that file. So if you want Dino AI to follow a specific pattern with your SQL queries, or if you want it to always ignore certain aspects of your project, you can be certain that the Dino rules file will be listened to, and it will show up in your prompts. With that, Fabio, thank you for teaching me and Kyle Stoff in this session. And we look forward to whatever's next week. Oh, and very last question. I think this is the most important question of this session. So you're using F1 data for this project, right?
yep, correct.
By chance, is this data up to date as of last week's F1 race?
Unfortunately not. But this is maybe actually, it's something we can take on for future session of how we can use the DinoAI agent to maybe call the public F1 API and update our data with most recent data. Just throwing out an idea. I'll have to see.
That's a nice one. That's a nice one. We should do that. I definitely.
I was mainly asking because you're an Italian. I'm assuming you're a big Ferrari fan.
Yep.
Do you have any insight as to why Ferrari finished in 8th place and 10th place last week?
There could be a multitude of reasons, but
Can DinoAI solve that one?
I don't know.
You need IoT data from the cars.
It's a long season, so we shouldn't just look at that one week. But maybe that's the question we answer next week: is why Ferrari is underperforming, perhaps.
We can definitely try and ask Dino and say, hey, can you provide some DinoAI rules on how the engineers and the driver should talk to each other? Because since then there's a lot of clashing there between the way how the communication works.
There we go. And then we'll sell into F1. That's perfect. Perfect. Lead into that.
There you go.
All right. Thank you for attending today's session. And this is obviously recorded. If you want to watch it again, I will provide it to you. And we look forward to talking more about DinoAI next week. See you guys.
Cheers.
Yep.
Bye-bye.